Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. When it comes to Nobel Literature Prize contenders, you might immediately think of Haruki Murakami's name, but in this issue, we want to introduce you to Greene, the author of The Power and the Glory. He had more extensive experience in this regard than Murakami because from the publication of his debut in 1929 until his death in 1991, Greene received a total of 21 Nobel Literature Prize nominations but never won. Nevertheless, critics from the academic circles and fellow writers still consider Greene to be one of the most outstanding novelists in the 20th century English literary world. Gabriel Garcia Marquez even said that Greene had the ability to tell a captivating, intricate story while infusing serious reflections that challenged mainstream moral and value systems, greatly influencing his own creative work. We have chosen Greene's work, The Power and the Glory, not only because of the author's renown in the gripping narrative but also because this book delves into a highly intriguing question. Why do religion and faith have such a significant impact on an individual, a nation, and a country's choices? What hidden struggles and redemptions of the soul lie beneath this? In Western history, for a long time, the power of the Pope surpassed that of kings. He was both a religious and political leader. However, with the onset of modernity, the Reformation, and the rise of capitalism, politics and religion began to separate. Today, Christianity has become secularized, and the Pope is solely a religious leader, no longer holding real political power. Nevertheless, the cultural and spiritual aspects of religion have not disappeared from everyday life. They have internalized into a cultural tradition, subtly influencing the choices of Western people. Moreover, the subtle influence of religion often proves to be more significant than we might imagine. The Power and the Glory on the surface tells the story of a priest on the run in a context where the government suppresses the church, depicting the various conflicts that ancient religious beliefs face in modern society. However, if we delve deeper, Greene also analyzes the underlying reasons behind these conflicts. When we read this novel, we are not just learning about religious stories and historical events from a distant time and place. We hope to gain a deeper understanding of Western culture and the reasons behind individual choices and even religious wars, both big and small. Since the story involves a lot of religious background knowledge, failure to explain it in a timely manner could hinder the comprehension of the work. Therefore, in this issue, I will interpret it by combining the storytelling with the supplementation of background knowledge. This approach demands a higher level of attention, and I hope you will listen carefully. Next, let's follow Greene and travel back to the 1930s in Mexico, a period filled with conflict. As a relatively young Catholic nation, the status of religion in Mexico differed somewhat from that on the European continent. In 1523, the Spanish government sent the first group of missionaries to Mexico, marking the beginning of Christian civilization's roots in the country. By the 19th century, Catholicism had become the core of Mexican society and culture, driving the Mexican independence movement. In post-independence Mexico, Catholicism did not secularize entirely as it did in Europe. It not only influenced the Mexican people on matters of faith and culture but also held considerable political sway and public authority. In the 20th century, the Mexican government viewed the church as the root cause of the people's unhappiness and a major obstacle to Mexico's progress. The church imposed stringent demands on its followers, asking them to endure suffering while enjoying a life of comfort and even corruption. Under the influence of this perception, the government initiated a series of measures aimed at curbing the power of the church, leading to conflicts between the government and the church. The novel depicts the late 1930s, a period when this conflict between the two sides was most intense. The novel unfolds from a third-person perspective, with the narrator in an omniscient position, having knowledge of all the characters' actions and emotions. This narrative approach allows the author not to focus solely on the protagonist, the priest, but instead, through a collage and montage of different characters and scenes, present the full scope of the story. At the beginning of the story, we follow Mr. Tench, an English dentist, who, amidst the scorching heat of Mexico, encounters a stranger who speaks English. This stranger has a scruffy beard, shabby clothing, a gaunt round face, and claims to be a doctor looking to board a ship to another city but lacks a ticket. Since the weather is unbearably hot, and the ship won't depart any time soon, Tench invites the stranger to rest at his home. Why is Tench so hospitable to a stranger he just met? Well, he hasn't had a conversation in English with anyone for a long time, and during the Prohibition era, finding alcohol is harder than finding someone who speaks English. Tench brings the stranger back to his house, and as they drink and chat, it becomes apparent that the stranger seems uneasy when drinking, as if burdened with guilt and remorse. Surprisingly, he shows a great interest in the stained glass that Tench has acquired from a Catholic church. Soon, a young boy knocks on the door, seeking the help of the self-proclaimed doctor to visit his critically ill mother. The stranger reluctantly accompanies the boy. When he leaves, Tench discovers that he has left behind a book with a cover that looks like a romance novel but contains Latin text. At this point in the story, Greene hasn't explicitly revealed the stranger's true identity as a priest, but the hints are quite obvious. The guilty demeanor when drinking, the unusual fascination with stained glass, all hint at the connection between this stranger and religion. Seeing this, we can reasonably infer that the boy didn't ask the stranger to treat his sick mother but rather to hear a dying confession. The book he left behind is likely the Bible, with a novel cover to conceal its true nature. In that era's Mexico, aiding a priest's escape was a capital offense, and the priest himself would be extremely cautious in such circumstances. However, why would a priest so carefully hiding his identity choose to abandon the opportunity to escape on a ship and instead accompany the boy? Greene's narrative stops here, leaving us with a cliffhanger. Greene's writing style in this novel is somewhat related to his previous experiences. Before writing The Power and the Glory, Greene supplemented his income by writing film reviews. Perhaps inspired by the way screenplays are constructed, the novel's different chapters resemble consecutive scenes in a movie. Each time, the focus shifts to a different character, and the connections between the scenes are not very tight. There's not even a clear plot progression. Greene merely introduces characters one by one and showcases their experiences. So, the narrative shifts once more, and we encounter a stern, serious, and meticulous lieutenant officer. His appearance and demeanor contrast sharply with his surroundings. Not only are the other officers in the police station lazy, but even the chief spends his time in the billiard room. However, on this day, the chief visits the office personally. It turns out that there's a priest on the run in their jurisdiction, which has angered the governor. The chief brings a photograph of the priest and orders the lieutenant to capture him before the rainy season begins. In the photograph, the priest appears relaxed, with a plump figure, sitting among a group of people, a far cry from the person Dr. Tench encountered earlier. Along with the priest's photograph, there's also a picture of a bank robber named James Calver. Please note that this person will play an important role in the priest's eventual capture, but let's leave that for now. As a government official, the lieutenant fully aligns with the government's views, believing that the church is the root cause of the Mexican people's unhappiness. Thus, he's willing to go to any lengths to capture the priest. He demands that each village surrender a hostage. If the villagers harbor the priest, these hostages will be executed by firing squad. In terms of character development, Greene intentionally creates two contrasting extremes with the priest and the lieutenant. The priest's moral character is highly questionable. He not only succumbs to the temptation of alcohol but also carries whiskey with him during his escape, earning him the nickname Whiskey Priest. He has even administered baptism while intoxicated and given a boy the name Brigida, a girl's name. In contrast, the lieutenant is meticulous in appearance, leads an impeccable private life, and maintains integrity and fairness in his work. He can almost be considered a moral exemplar. Why would a morally questionable priest choose the path of martyrdom, while an upstanding lieutenant is willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals? What truly defines goodness and evil? Greene poses these questions to the reader in just 2 chapters. As the narrative returns to the priest, he is struggling on a mule through a forest, evading pursuit by the police. It's as if he's answering a call from destiny, embarking on a journey back to his hometown after 6 long years. During his time on the run, he has discarded the Bible and the altar stone used for Mass, and now he carries the moniker of the Whiskey Priest. He returns with a sense of resignation about his past failures and misdeeds. In the village, the first person he encounters is Maria. 5 years ago, after getting drunk, he had a one-night stand with Maria, and she later gave birth to a daughter named Brigitta. It turns out that the name he gave to the boy earlier was actually his daughter's name. Maria takes the priest in, but poverty and societal prejudice have affected Brigitta, leading to a distant relationship between the daughter and her father, something the priest is acutely aware of. Early the next morning, the priest conducts mass for the villagers, but the police arrive before he can finish. Due to his lengthy escape, the priest's appearance has changed significantly from the photograph, and the lieutenant fails to recognize him. The villagers also choose not to betray him, despite the lieutenant's threats of executing the hostages. This illustrates that, in Mexico at the time, Catholicism still had a solid foothold among the populace. Even when facing the prospect of hostages being shot, the villagers refused to forsake their original faith. This indirectly explains why progressive individuals like the lieutenant held such animosity toward Catholicism. In the first half of the 20th century, many countries faced the dilemma of achieving modernization. During this process, they realized that to promote societal change, they needed an ideological revolution first, which required overthrowing old ideologies. It was precisely because of the deep influence of Catholicism among the Mexican people that it became the primary target. The development of modern civilization is a highly complex process, with significant differences between regions and countries. However, behind these differences, many commonalities exist. In Greene's depiction of religious persecution in Mexico, there are distinct regional characteristics, but the underlying historical challenges of modernization are universal. Having narrowly escaped the police, the priest continues on his journey, determined to reach his birthplace, Carmen. Along the way, he encounters a mestizo, who sees through his true identity at first glance. The mestizo decides to follow the priest, hoping to seize the opportunity to claim the government's bounty. The priest, in turn, recognizes the mestizo's intentions but doesn't firmly shake him off. Thus, the two begin traveling together. Along the way, the priest engages in constant self-reflection, recalling his initial motivations for taking up the priesthood, reminiscing about how he once refused to be confined to a small church and aspired to do more. Eventually, he realizes that his reluctance to accept the government's orders to renounce his priesthood isn't rooted in deep faith but rather in excessive pride. He is unwilling to lower his stature by joining the ranks of priests who have renounced their faith. It's worth noting that in Catholic doctrine, pride is considered one of the 7 deadly sins. When the priest comes to this realization, his journey of redemption unfolds. From that point onward, his actions are no longer driven by inner pride but by a steadfast commitment to his responsibilities. As he approaches Carmen, the priest instructs the mule to enter the town with the ailing mestizo alone and departs himself, turning away. Having escaped from the mestizo, the priest once again finds himself wandering the streets, much like at the beginning of the story. He seeks to buy some wine for religious rituals and is approached by a beggar who initially intended to rob him. The beggar, upon understanding the priest's intentions, leads him to a wine merchant. However, the money the priest has is only enough to buy a bottle of wine and a bottle of whiskey. The wine merchant, exploiting his status as the governor's brother, brazenly drinks the entire bottle of wine in front of the priest. With no wine left, the priest is unable to perform a proper Massachusetts. After leaving the wine merchant, he is discovered to be carrying whiskey and is subsequently apprehended by the police. The police are unaware of the priest's true identity and do not pay much attention to his possession of concealed alcohol. They merely want him to pay a fine and be on his way. However, being penniless, the priest cannot afford to pay the fine and is compelled to offer labor in exchange, agreeing to clean the jail cells. The cells house a variety of inmates, including senile old men, thieves, murderers, and interestingly, Catholic believers as proud as he once was. After enduring these hardships and gaining insight into his own weaknesses, the priest voluntarily reveals his identity to his fellow inmates. Surprisingly, none of them betray him. Once he has finished cleaning the cells, the police release him. Before leaving, the lieutenant, out of sympathy, gives him 5 pesos, which happens to be the fee for a single mass, a poignant coincidence filled with irony. At this point, the priest has completely shed his inner pride. He continues his journey northward, attempting to cross the border into the United States and escape his pursuers once and for all. Along the way, he grapples with hunger and even fights a wounded dog for a piece of meat. In the end, exhausted, he arrives at the border. The whiskey priest's journey of escape is both a descent into darkness and a path towards martyrdom. Along the way, he continually drinks alcohol, defying his religious principles, discards religious artifacts representing God, and eventually even competes with the dog for food. All of this demonstrates the priest's weakness and humility. However, it is precisely these human weaknesses that highlight the radiance of divinity. In this sense, by acknowledging human flaws and the darkness within human nature, one can discover the essence of being human, which, in turn, may be the ultimate form of worship to God. As early as 1926, Greene converted to Catholicism in order to marry his fiancée, who was a Catholic. He once stated that his conversion was based on rational conviction rather than emotional resonance. It wasn't until his trip to Mexico in 1938, where he witnessed the expulsion of priests, the desolation of churches, clandestine masses, and encountered armed bandits, that he found a form of faith rooted in religious emotion. It was during this time that he wrote The Power and the Glory in 1940. This may explain why Greene created the character of the whiskey priest, to explore the emotionally resonant power of Catholicism rather than just its rational aspects. Perhaps this is Greene's interpretation of redemption, to find the moving force of Catholicism in the realm of emotions rather than just reason. Interestingly, Greene's understanding of faith in this way is secularized and modernized. Returning to the story, the priest's escape reaches its climax in the third part of the novel. The unconscious priest is brought to the farm of the Lair siblings by the villagers, and by this time, he has crossed the border and is in the United States. At the farm, the priest is given shelter and hospitality by the Lair siblings. As Protestant Christians, they do not look down upon the priest due to religious differences. However, Mr. Lair struggles to understand the various rituals and practices of Catholicism. This is an important detail because the priest and Mr. Lair represent two opposing religious forces. Through their interactions, an important chapter in the history of religious transformation is brought into focus. In the history of Christianity, the division between Protestantism and Catholicism is considered a significant event. This division can be traced back to the 16th century when Martin Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation in the German region. This movement curtailed the power of the Catholic Church, facilitated the secularization of Christianity, and contributed to the development of capitalism. As a prominent branch of Protestantism, Lutheranism simplified many aspects of doctrine and ritual. Unlike Catholicism, Lutherans tended to eschew pomp and extravagance, believing that a frugal and disciplined way of life, along with a spirit of hard work, was the best way to serve God. The rise of Protestantism and the development of capitalism are closely intertwined. This connection was extensively explored by the renowned sociologist Max Weber in his work The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. If you're interested in this topic, you might want to listen to an analysis of this book available on the platform. Greene's deliberate juxtaposition of these two characters in the novel is not coincidental. However, he doesn't impose a definitive conclusion on readers but rather reflects the changes and developments within Christianity through this contrast. After resting on the farm for a few days, the priest holds a mass for the local villagers and hears their confessions. He continues to be respected among the villagers, except for the local schoolteacher. This arrangement is laden with meaning, as the schoolteacher can be seen as a representation of education. Throughout European history, the rise of capitalism was not only facilitated by the religious reform initiated by Martin Luther but also benefited from advancements in science and technology. Education, a vital force behind scientific progress, played a significant role in liberating people from ignorance. The schoolteacher's rejection of the priest directly reflects the conflict between science and religion. For ordinary people, it can be distilled into a simple, direct question: which is more important, religious faith that serves as a spiritual anchor, or scientific and technological progress that drives societal advancement. However, simple questions do not always have straightforward answers. From a modern perspective, we can understand that many people cannot grasp the various contradictions that arise in the process of civilization. When they can only place their hopes in simple faith, the heavy-handed suppression of religion does not fundamentally resolve these issues. Furthermore, we can extrapolate from this situation. If you perceive history as a linear progression that continually evolves, it becomes easy to oversimplify society and human nature. Historians and sociologists may be more concerned with the orderly march of progress, but literary authors often focus on those who, for various reasons, fall behind or find themselves in difficult positions at the crossroads of time. Observing their thought processes and emotional orientations, documenting their predicaments in the gaps of time, uniquely showcases the value of literature. Without novels like The Power and the Glory, which pays attention to the laggards, one cannot fully comprehend the complexity of human society. Let's return to the story. After conducting the religious service, the mestizo reappears before the priest like a ghost. He claims to be sent by the wanted criminal James Calver to ask the priest to hear his dying confession. At the beginning of the story, photographs of the priest and Calver were placed together on the police chief's desk, and now fate once again links them together. The priest knows it's a trap but still follows the mestizo back to the border. This time, what compels him is not his inner pride but rather his commitment to his vocation. Just as a doctor's professional ethics dictate that they must not abandon a dying patient, the priest's professional ethics require him not to refuse a believer's request for a dying confession. Astute readers will notice that this situation mirrors the opening of the novel, where the priest followed the young boy to administer the last rites for his mother. However, this time, the priest is not only saving another person but also seeking redemption for his own sins of pride. In a small cabin on the mountainside, the priest encounters the dying James Calver, prepared to hear his confession. However, Calver requests the priest to leave quickly, realizing that the police have set up an ambush to capture the priest. He knows that they plan to use him to apprehend the priest. The priest refuses Calver's request and instead asks him to sincerely confess his sins. These two longtime fugitives are acutely aware that this is a police trap. At this moment, Calver, once a ruthless robber, is dedicated to protecting the priest, while the priest, who had previously been morally compromised and filled with pride, is determined to fulfill the mission God has given him. In the final moments of their lives, both men achieve self-redemption. Finally, the lieutenant successfully captures the priest and brings him back to Mexico for trial. The priest accepts his fate calmly and only requests to perform a final confession. However, his request is denied, not by the lieutenant, but by another priest who has renounced his clerical status, the last remaining priest in town. On the night before his execution, the priest sits in his cell, drinking the brandy brought to him by the lieutenant, and engages in solitary penance. He confesses to his inner sins, and as the dawn approaches, he welcomes the arrival of death. In the novel's conclusion, the whiskey priest's deeds become a new legend of martyrdom. On the night of his execution, another priest from a different province arrives, and it appears that similar religious stories will continue to play out on the Mexican soil. The boundary between good and evil can only be left for the reader to contemplate. Before concluding this segment, let's revisit the significance of the book's title, The Power and the Glory. On the surface, the Mexican government and the lieutenant symbolize power, as they utilize the state apparatus to enforce religious persecution policies. Conversely, the church and the priest's journey represent glory, as they symbolize the pursuit of a divine mission. However, beneath this apparent opposition, these two words hold a deeper meaning. In the Lord's Prayer found in the Bible, there is a line that says, "Yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever," with yours referring to God. Perhaps we can interpret Greene's use of the book's title as a suggestion not to get caught up in determining right from wrong in the conflict between the lieutenant and the priest's positions. This might reflect Greene's ultimate contemplation as a Catholic, reminding us not to oversimplify the complex question of human existence. Clearly, such reflections are not outdated and will continue to be relevant. Throughout the retelling of this story, we have discussed several key points that deserve special attention. 1. In the 1930s, religious persecution took place in Mexico as part of broader social reforms. Behind this persecution was the government's commitment to advancing societal change. Although Greene does not directly delve into this topic in the novel, characters like the lieutenant and the schoolteacher reflect the prevailing sentiment in Mexican society at the time. Religion was seen as an obstacle to progress, and the conflict between religious faith and societal reform was intense. However, on the secular level, this binary opposition of right and wrong is not a simple matter. 2. Greene was a master storyteller who drew inspiration from various script-writing techniques. The shifts between characters and scenes in the novel resemble the montage style of filmmaking, lending a compelling rhythm to the story, even though it lacks a strong plot. 3. Within the novel's details, we can also discern the historical evolution of religion. In the history of Christianity, the split between Protestantism and Catholicism, dating back to the 16th century when Martin Luther initiated the Reformation, played a pivotal role. This movement curtailed the power of the Catholic Church, contributed to the secularization of Christianity, and facilitated the development of capitalism. 4. As an intellectual who came of age after World War I in Europe, Greene could not avoid contemplating the intricate relationship between science, reason, technology, and faith. When he placed this reflection in a country like Mexico, which was urgently seeking prosperity, the real-world significance behind this question becomes even more universal and pressing. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.